For those who were in Belgrade last year, they probably heard already about the research project organized conjointly by the University of Bologna, Padua, and Oxford. And we thought it would be nice, rather than to have a presentation during one of the sessions, to have it in the General Assembly, because it's also important for us to have a research project who actually is looking at our community. So I'll leave.
Thank you. Now, I have some slides. Are they easy to find? Let me just say thank you for letting me have 5 minutes of your time to talk about this. It is in complement to the UMAC survey. We had originally intended to begin the research at a quantitative level, but when we learned that UMAC survey was happening, we changed our research strategy to start with some qualitative and case study and ethnographic work. So I'll report on that. And this having been now done in 3 places, we're better prepared to integrate the quantitative results that will come in through the UMAC survey. So if I can also put in a plea to everyone to fill in that survey when it comes, it'll be that much more valuable. Now, very briefly, as Sebastian said, last year when I spoke to you, I began by asking how many of you feel that you have everything you need to do your job as well as you possibly can. And most of you answered with candor that you can't agree that you do. There are no organizations in the world where if you ask that question, people will say, oh, yes. And so the point of studying organizations from that premise, that initial premise, what would make it better, what would make your job better, is the point of this research, looking at academic and university museums and collections as organizations. What machine is it on? Which machine is it on? Is it on this one or this one? No? Yeah? No? Okay, I'll just scroll it. Yeah. Okay, that's fine. All right, thank you. So we started with looking at some parts of the university systems in Oxford, Padua, and Bologna. Some work had been done prior. Some work was done over the past year. Then we began with a scoping exercise similar to the sort of survey work that's happening through the UMAC survey, and then we did some deeper dive qualitative observational work looking at management practices. A lot of this derives in much the same way as was referred to on our first day here, looking at competing values framework. How do the different imperatives of different organizational roles within these organizations compete with each other, and how do they resolve in order to operate? And just to be very, very brief about the findings thus far in these 3 sites, these 3 field sites, there are a lot of data relating to concerns that people have, their use of time, and the barriers and enablers of their work. And I can be a little bit more specific. There's a lot of data relating to the role of university museums and defining the sense of purpose. There's a lot of data about this sort of third mission, as we refer to it over the course of the past few days, particularly with respect to students and also younger students, so pre-university learning. Enormous amounts of information about the significance of different governance models and the level of autonomy that an individual institution has relative either to its university or more broadly. Then there are considerations around management, and then relevant to the theme of this week, this conference, a lot of interest in partnering with other institutions, partly to get over organizational constraints that obtain, and then big issues relating to leadership and leadership development, not simply in terms of professional training, but much more broadly where the pipeline of current and future leadership is coming from. I can give you findings relating to the UK. I'm not going to talk about the ones relating to the 2 Italian institutions because my colleagues are better placed to do that, but we'll have similar results. And I won't talk through all of this, but just to point out, for example, one big finding, which is not a surprise, is that in university museums, there is a big shift in the relationship with external finance, and the shift is absolutely huge. There was sort of no involvement in commercial sponsorship 3 years ago, and there is envisaged a very large shift in commercial sponsorship 3 years hence. And that's a much bigger shift than you see in other types of museums, although similar institutions in governance terms, such as what in the UK are called local authority museums, show a similar big shift, although nowhere near as big. Other considerations involve leaders, what leaders of these university museums spend most of their time doing. So, for example, in this chart, you can see that they're shifting much more of their time to commercial considerations. Here, we asked them to consider how they would generally position their organization along a continuum from culture on the one side to commerce on the other. Just draw a line now and in the future. So now people average out as more cultural than commercial in their concern and in their activity, but they see a shift more towards commercial considerations in the future. Now, none of that's surprising. Of course, as funding constraints accelerate, there has to be other sources of funding sought, and earned income is one of them. But there's a skills gap. People recognize the need for that, don't really understand how to accomplish it in sufficient detail. Steph? Broad, very broad. So that was a subject of much discussion, but if I could sort of over-summarize it, I'd say anything that you have to earn rather than is granted. Okay. There are other questions relating to overlapping purpose. So the competing values framework is mapped into this sort of output where we're looking at one layer of stakeholders or purposes that range from culture and commerce, and a third mission, and then embraced within that a skills base that has to do with questions of credibility, of ability, and of ability to access resources. Those things converge on an ability to articulate and implement on a stated purpose. I won't go into more details about this because this stuff hasn't been released publicly. And incidentally, please don't tweet this because on Wednesday I'm going to release it. But it is interesting, and the Italian results are similar and without particular surprises. Now I can go into a little bit more detail about one of the institutions we looked at in Oxford, and that is well represented in this room. Silke very kindly let us analyze her Museum of the History of Science, and we found three big problems. The woman that worked with Silke found three big problems relating to space, money, and an ability to do and implement strategy. The reaction to that in specific recommendation format is there can be efficiencies gained from re-engaging with space, re-engaging with funding, and then freeing up leadership resource for other purposes. And the implications of that, well, those recommendations have been put in place already in Silke's institution and are providing a model for other museums in the Oxford University system. We think there may be a basis for deriving some more general recommendations for university museums as a whole. So our next phase is to expand the scope to other university museums, to do other qualitative studies of the same nature, and then to compare with quantitative data such as we can derive from survey work. We're considering hypothesizing around these emerging patterns, regulatory implications, governance implications, leadership implications, and then most strongly questions relating to the autonomy of university museums. What types of decisions are possible given these exogenous conditions? Just to give credit where credit is due, much of this work has been done by other people who are not here. The Italians above, far more stylish photos than mine, and some sense of our timeline. We are, I'm pleased to say, pretty much on time with 3 work packages that began in Bologna, moved to other institutions, and are moving to dissemination mechanisms such as this, which you have kindly provided me with. So that's the end of my 5 minutes. Thank you for your time and attention. We will be in touch to see if we can be of use to you in any way. So thank you very much.